All right, so I want to go ahead and get into this word because I don't want you to have to be here very long, but I just want to take my time and share what God has given to me. And as I said in my prayer, that as I was putting this word together, as he was downloading some things to me, it was ministering to me and it was causing me to take a look at myself and some choices and decisions that I have made. And, you know, this past 2 Sundays ago, we celebrated 10 years of ministry. And, you know, it was a celebration, and it was also a time for me and Pastor to reflect about where God had brought us and how we started and how we got to this place. And, you know, I was thinking about, it actually started back when we were courting, and you know, many of you know the story who's been here for a certain amount of time, that God called him to go back to his hometown of Duplin County, and he'd done that about 3 or 4 months after we had started seeing one another. And he came to me and told me that he was going back home. And of course I said, okay. And I had already known that this was the person that God had called me to spend the rest of my life with. So, you know, in that time, he went back home, and I was still here in Charlotte, and we were going through premarital counseling. And I remember whenever we would talk on the phone often, and I would tell him some things that were going on, he would always say, Ancelita, you got to have faith. You got to put your faith out there. You got to put your faith out there. And I, you know, didn't always want to hear that. Sometimes you just want to talk, and sometimes you just want to let your feelings be known, and you don't want to always hear someone encouraging you. But nevertheless, that's what he was doing. And of course, he was encouraging me because of where he was. God had called him from Charlotte back home. And so I know that wasn't an easy task for him. Nevertheless, as time went on and we were going through, you know, premarital counseling, and we had met with our pastor, and, you know, by this time, we had found a place to live, and we were going to live in Wilmington, and we'd found a place to live, so we found an apartment, and I had moved most of my things there so we could just slowly get things set up. So after we said our I-dos, we could just head on home, and we didn't have to think about doing too much. So I remember sitting in premarital counseling and with Pastor Gould, and we were talking, and after he had gone through some things with me that he wanted to share, before we left, I said, you know, Pastor Gould, I have a plan. I said, you know, I'm not working. At the time, my grandmother and my aunt had allowed me to move in with them, so I didn't have my apartment here in Charlotte, and I had to give up my job because I was getting married in that October, and so they didn't want me to start a job and then have to find another teacher. So I said, I have a plan. We've already got our apartment. Everything is set up. I said, so I'm going to go back I'm going to move to Wilmington. I'm going to move into our apartment. I'm going to get a job. I'm going to apply for a teaching position so we can go ahead and I can have things in order when we get there. I'm a planner. I'm an organizer. You know, I don't like to be caught off guard. And, you know, if anybody knows Pastor Gould, or if you've ever talked to him or been in counseling with him, you know, he sat in his reclining chair in his office, and he reared back, and, you know, he nodded his head as I was talking, and he wasn't saying much, and I was telling him what I was planning to do, and, you know, he said, no, you're not going to do that. You know, and my heart just fell to my stomach. And I was like, okay. I said, well, he said, you're not going to do that. And I said, okay. And I said, well, he said, why do you want to do that? And I said, well, you know, Pastor Gould, I said, I like to have things planned out. And I said, that way I already have a job, and I don't have to look for a job when we get there. And, you know, I can go ahead, and we have the apartment. It's just sitting. You know, this was around in July when we were meeting. And I said, it's just sitting there. Nobody's living in it. And Pastor Newkirk was going down maybe once on the weekend just to walk through it and let people know that we were living, that somebody was actually living there. And he said, no, you're not doing that. And I said, okay. I said, okay. And I just, you know, I was one of those people that if my man of God said, this is what you do, this is what you did. But my heart was hurting because I was trying to figure out, I was like, okay, well, Lord, you know, this was a really good plan. And if I could just stick to my plan, everything would be okay. And he said, and I'm going to tell you why you're not going to do it. And I said, okay. He said, you have money saved, right? And I said, yes, sir, I do. And he said, you're living with your grandmother. You're not having to pay rent. They're not asking anything of you. And I said, no, sir. And he said, well, you're fine. And he said, but most of all, you got to be led by God, and you got to start walking in faith. And I just looked at him, and I thought back to what my husband, now my husband is now, what my husband right then, but what he would always say to me in conversation about, Ansley, you got to have faith. Now, mind you, I was, I thought I had faith. I really did. I thought I was a woman of faith, and I felt like that whatever God said that I did. But, this was a different, I think he was trying to teach me that now you've got to go beyond what you know and start pressing into some things that you don't know. And I was just sitting there, and I was like, well, you know what? When I think back to that, and I guess what he was trying to say to me too is that, yeah, you have faith. You have a place to live. You have a job. You had income coming in. Bills were paid. We have faith for those moments. But when it was time for me to step into something new, it was time for me to develop my faith for those moments. And so he just said, you just hold tight. Everything will work itself out once you get to where you're going. So nevertheless, we got married, and we moved to Wilmington. He had to ease me into Duplin County. And so we got married, and we lived in Wilmington for a year. Everything was okay. I did not get employment until January. So I went, 3.5 months, no employment. He was working part-time back home, so he was driving to Duplin County every day, and I was sitting at home. But at the time that I was sitting at home, it was an opportunity for me to spend time with the Lord. That was that moment. At the time, I didn't see it that way. I didn't quite understand that, but it was. And so I dug in the Word, and I, just got, fostered my relationship with the Lord. And that was my opportunity, my moment where God was really developing my faith. Because even though we were there in Wilmington, and even though we were married now, but it didn't mean that everything was going to work out for our good. The way I thought it was, I should say, let me say it that way. And I remember what Pastor Gu said about you needing to develop your faith. And so while my husband was back home for almost a year, you've heard his story, you've heard his testimony. He was at home, he went home, he didn't have a job. Because he didn't have a job, he lost his vehicle, it got repossessed, and so he didn't have a car. And so it was like, well, I have no job, I have no car, how am I going to get to a job? So some things you may not know, he was applying everywhere. Now, if you've never been to Duplin County, don't know a whole lot about Duplin County, there's not a lot of jobs there for you. So, you have your little eateries. At that time, there wasn't even, I don't recall if there was even a McDonald's there. I think the McDonald's may have been like in Warsaw. Yeah, thank you, Mika. Mika's from Duplin County, so she knows. It may have been in Warsaw. So he had gone and applied for a job at McDonald's, and they wouldn't hire him because they said he was too experienced. And so, like I said, his testimony and how he got the job at James Sprint, but he had already been walking that walk because he knew that God had called him to go back home, but he didn't know how it was going to happen when he got back home. So to take that journey, to go home and move back in with your family, and they're wondering why you're here and so forth, and then to get married. And before we got married, and when he proposed, I didn't have a ring. He just proposed, and I said yes. So I said yes with no ring on my finger because he didn't have any money to buy me a ring at the time. So I didn't have a ring, and you know what it's like when you tell people you're engaged and you're getting married. First thing they want to do is look at your finger. They want to know, well, and people would look, but then they didn't say anything, and I was just like, the ring is coming. It's coming. That's what I would tell people, because I know they wanted to ask, but they didn't ask. And I was like, good, because it's not your business. However, it was coming. So, I reminisce about all that, and I think about all that because where we are today in our ministry, in our life, it was a walk of faith. And it was a faith walk I did not want to take. It was challenging. It was hard. But we had to do it. I had to do it. And we had to do that together, because in order for us to get to this place where God has brought us 10 years later in ministry, 20 years together as husband and wife, that's what it was. It was nothing but faith. And when I think back to that, I think about what he was telling me when I would call him, what Pastor Gould was trying to get through to me when we were in premarital counseling, and then what we had to go through, the challenges that we had. But God always saw us through in those challenges. And then we were talking about a week ago, and we were thinking about when we started this ministry. And, we went back, when we moved back to Charlotte, we went back to Victory. We served there for about 2.5 years. And then God had spoke to us and told us it was time to go. And we started in our home, and then from our home to the school, and our school to Belhaven to here. But all of that time, when God was speaking and saying, you start this ministry, you step out, it was not an easy task, because we didn't have the money to start a ministry. Nobody just said, hey, here's 10 grand, go start a church. That money was coming from us. So we were taking from our home to build a ministry, and God saw us through that. But then, God also brought people in. So God was like, you know what, I got you. But every step of the way, we had to look to him. It wasn't going to happen any other way. And when we tried to do it our way, it always failed. And we saw that, because sometimes we would put our hands in the pot and we would see that this isn't working. We have to go back to what God called us to do. And so 10 years later, here we are. Some people are still with us that were with us from the first day, from the moment we were in our home. God has brought people in, and they have left, and some people left because it was for them to leave. It was time for them to go, and some people left because they just felt like, it wasn't working here. And some people, God just moved out because he knew he needed to move them out. But nevertheless, we're here, and it's only by the grace of God, and it's only through faith that we are here. So today, if you probably haven't figured it out yet, that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about faith. But the subtopic, or to go with that, faith, your decision, your choice. Because faith is a choice. Faith is a decision. Just like God has given us free will, we have free will to have faith. And it's up to you whether or not how you want to walk in it. So I want to start with you. Turn with me to Hebrews chapter 11. And this is going to be in the NET. Hebrews chapter 11. Verse 23, and we're going to read verse 23 through verse 29, and this is in the New English translation that I will be reading this from. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 23 through 29. And if you know anything about Hebrews, it's known as the faith chapter. And in this chapter, we see all the biblical heroes, or patriarchs, however we want to call them, from the Old Testament, and how they applied and lived by faith in order to produce the reward that was due to them. So Hebrews chapter 11, starting with verse 23 to 29, and it reads, "It was by faith that Moses' parents hid him for 3 months when he was born. They saw that God had given them an unusual child, and they were not afraid to disobey the king's command. It was by faith that Moses, when he grew up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to share the oppression of God's people instead of enjoying the fleeting pleasures of sin. He thought it was better to suffer for the sake of Christ than to own the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to his great reward. It was by faith that Moses left the land of Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He kept right on going because he kept his eyes on the one who was invisible. It was by faith that Moses commanded the people of Israel to keep the Passover and to sprinkle the blood on the doorposts so that the angel of death would not kill their firstborn sons. It was by faith that the people of Israel went right through the Red Sea as though they were on dry ground. But when the Egyptians tried to follow, they were all drowned." Within these 6 verses, we see the godly kind of faith, the true faith that Moses exhibited. But before Moses could exhibit this type of faith, it had to start somewhere. And it started with his parents. His parents exhibited this type of faith. So let's turn over to Exodus chapter 2, and this is in the New King James Version. Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 through 2. So in Exodus chapter 2, verses 1 through 2, it says, "And a man of the house of Levi went and took as wife a daughter of Levi. So the woman conceived and bore a son. And when she saw that he was a beautiful child, she hid him 3 months." So the New King James says that his parents hid him for 3 months because they saw he was beautiful. Now, I'm pretty sure that when people have children, everybody looks at their child and thinks their child is beautiful. However, this here was something a little different. God had given her eyes to see something different in her son. So if you know the story, we're not going to read it, but you know the story where the king had given the decree for all the babies at that time they were 2 and under, to be killed, because of course he was afraid that somebody would come and take his spot. So he had them to be killed. But Moses' mother, she made a faith decision. She decided that she was going to save her child, no matter what the decree was that had gone out. She recognized in her son that he had a special purpose, and she was not going to allow that purpose to be thwarted by a decree that had gone out from the king. So his parents decided to hide him for 3 months. Now, can you imagine trying to hide a baby, a newborn, for 3 months? Because they were coming from door to door looking for these children. But for 3 months, she hid him. I'm sure he cried. I'm sure he made noises. I'm sure they came to his house. But God supernaturally helped her to do that, to hide her son, to hide Moses, because God also knew, God had already chosen him to do something special for the children of Israel. So turn with me over to Acts chapter 7, and we're going to look at verses 20 through 22. So we have Moses, we have the mom, the dad, the family, basically parents that hid him for 3 months because they knew that he had a promise, a purpose on his life. And then we're going to look and see here in Acts chapter 7, verses 20 through 22, and we see what God says. It says, "At this time, Moses was born and was well-pleasing to God, and he was brought up in his father's house for 3 months. But when he was set out, Pharaoh's daughter took him away and brought him up as her own son. And Moses was learned in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was mighty in words and deeds." So God also knew something about Moses. He also said that Moses was pleasing. And of course, so we have the parents, and then we have God who says Moses is pleasing. So of course, he had already made up his mind who he was going to have to deliver the children from Israel. And so we have his parents they demonstrated what I would call true faith, and they hid their son. And then all of a sudden, she decides at 3 months, she gets this plan. And she says, okay, she builds him this little basket. She wraps him in this blanket, and she sets him off into the river. She pushes him off, and he just kind of floats in the water, not really sure where he's going to go. She tells the daughter, his sister Miriam, follow the baby, follow the basket around, and wherever he ends up, make sure everything is okay. But what a miracle for him to just so happen to float in the direction of Pharaoh's daughter. And then when he floats in that direction, she sees him. She's out in the water, wading in the water, and she gets him. Now, I would like to think that when she saw him, she knew that he was a Hebrew. Okay? So he just wasn't some random child floating in the water. But she didn't, quote unquote, turn him in. She saw him. She saw that he was beautiful. She evidently had a desire for a child, and she decided to keep him. So here's Miriam, who is standing at the back. She sees the baby, sees Pharaoh's daughter, and she goes up to her and she says, "Hey, do you want me to get somebody to help you to keep him?" to help you to nurse him? And she's like, yeah. She's like, well, ooh, I know somebody. She just so happens to know somebody that can nurse and keep this child. So she goes and gets her mother. So again, the mother's faith and her plan is already being enacted with what God wants to happen for his people. So she gets her mother, and the mother lives in the courts. She becomes his nurse. She becomes, she's taking care of her own son and is nursing and raising her own son. So how great could that be? So here we, pushing forward, Moses grows up. He grows up in the palace. He has the opportunity. Can you imagine him? He's sitting as playing around the throne of Pharaoh. He's called the Prince of Egypt. He becomes the adopted son of his daughter. Pharaoh loves him as his own, if you want to call it grandson or what have you. He's learned in all the wisdom of Egypt. He receives all the riches, the wealth that Egypt has to offer. He has the best life ever. And he lives this way for over 40 years. But then something happens. It's time, the faith that his mother was exhibiting, now that same spirit has to come upon him, because now it's time for him to do the job that he was designed to do, that he was created to do, that he was saved to do. But in order for Moses to do this, Moses had to have some faith. He had to have faith, because I don't know about you, but after 40 years of being raised in a palace and being taken care of and having the best of everything, and I just don't know if I want to go and announce to the kingdom that, guess what, I'm a Hebrew. I don't know if I want to do that. And I'm gonna be honest, I probably would me and God have to have a couple of conversations about that. Like, can we do this another way? However, so that same spirit that was on his mother, the mom, I'm pretty sure she's like, now you need to do what you're called to do. God is saying you need to do what you're called to do. So let's go back up. I want to look again back up at Hebrews 11 and 20, verse 24. And I really want to start at verse 24. Again, it was by faith that Moses, when he grew up, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He chose to share the oppression of God's people instead of enjoying the fleeting pleasures of sin. How many of us would have thought about the life that he was living was sinful? Because that's all he knew. He thought it was better to suffer for the sake of Christ than to own the treasures of Egypt, for he was looking ahead to his great reward. So Moses did not look at what he had and what he had been blessed with growing up in Egypt as a great reward. He knew that there was something better. He knew that God had called him for something greater. So he was looking ahead. I don't think Moses envisioned that the turmoil and trials that they were going to go through once they got out of Egypt. However, he says that he was looking ahead at his great reward. Because many of us today, if we think about it, right now, we're just looking at today. We're just looking at what's in front of us right now. We're looking at the great job we have. We're looking at the benefits that we have. We're looking at, I got a 401k and I got an IRA and I'm set. And you've heard Pastor Newkirk say several times, get sick. And all that can be drained in one moment. Let something die or happen in your life where your finances are going to come into play and all that can be taken from you in one moment. So, but he was looking ahead. Now, he didn't know what was going to happen as he was looking ahead, and he didn't know the trials that he was going to go to, but he knew that there was something greater than what he had. And then it says in chapter 27, verse 27, it was by faith that Moses left the land of Egypt, not fearing the king's anger. He kept right on going because he kept his eyes on the one who is invisible. And when I read that and I think about, again, when I was thinking about how God had brought us to this point, 10 years in ministry, and I was thinking about how often, not just how often, but just about every day, we have to keep our eyes on the one who is invisible, because that's the one who is supplying our needs. That's the one who is our Jehovah Jireh. That's the one who's meeting our needs from day to day to day. Because when we don't have it, when we don't know how we're going to get it, that's the one that we're turning to. And so we have to always keep our eyes on the one who is invisible. So rather than turning away from the reproach of Christ, Moses embraced it. He viewed it as something better and greater than all the riches of Egypt. He chose not to live just for the present. And that's where, when I think back to when I was in premarital counseling and what Pastor Gould was saying to me, he was like, I think about that. And he's like, you're living for the present. You're not living for the future. And you got to think ahead. Right now, this is good, and what your plan is good, but it's not. You got to plan for your future. You got to keep your eyes on the one that you cannot see. And so, so then again, as I stated, I said Moses demonstrated true faith. And you can write this down if you want, but I read where someone said one person has described faith as a forward-looking trust in the face of the unknown, what you can't see, based on what the believer knows of God. So when I read that, I think about, it says at the end, it says what the believer knows of God. So it's not what Pastor Newkirk may stand up here and tell you about God, but it's what you know about him for yourself. So some people know him as a healer. Some people know him as a deliverer. Some people know him as a provider. I think we all know him as a provider. However, but you can't have a true relationship with God. You can't have a true faith relationship with God if you don't know anything about him. If you're only focusing on what you have now and not willing to have to go through some things for him to show you who he really is, you're always going to be stuck in the same place. You're always going to be going through the same thing. So everybody has their own relationship with the Lord. Everybody has their own belief about him. So I can't tell you what to believe. You have to do that on your own. And so when I think about that, is also, many of us, everybody God has called us to do different things. Some of us, we have our own ministry. Some of us, now in the days of social media, you can do your podcast, you can do YouTube, you can do all types of things. We start our own businesses. Some of us are entrepreneurs and so forth. But how are we moving forward in those areas? If, we love to say, well, God called me to do this and God told me to do this. But when it's time for you to make a choice, when it's time for you to make a decision on how you're going to go about what God has called you to do, are you making those decisions? Are you making those choices in faith? If he called you to if he's called you to do a ministry, to start a ministry, are you doing it out of your own will? Or are you doing it in faith? Because I'm going to tell you, it's going to get tough. I think about when we were trying to, when we were in Wilmington, and, we always knew we were going to be in ministry. I mean, that wasn't a doubt. It was just how we were going to navigate it, how God was going to do it. And I remember, he always had a plan. Pastor Newkirk always had a plan, and somehow I was always in that plan. And he said, well, let's just start with Bible study. Everybody starts with Bible study. So he's like, let's do Bible study. Well, we only had a 1-bedroom apartment, so he was like, well, instead of having people come over to our apartment, we are going to rent a space. So there was a hotel, I believe it may have been the Marriott, that was right around off of Market Street in Wilmington. And so we went and we looked into renting the space. And so you could rent the room for, I think it's like $75 a week for the room. And they would set the room up for you every week, and you just give them the date and time that you want to come. And so we did that. And again, it was our own money. We were coming out of our own pocket to do this. But we believed, God had called us to do things. And this is what we were just going to put it down. We were going to do it. And so then he was like, well, we need to advertise. How are we going to advertise? And so, of course, me being a teacher, I was like, ooh, I can make flyers and we can send them out, and I can pass them out in our apartment complex. The hotel, the receptionist at the hotel, she said we could leave them at the hotel and people could pick them up, because the hotel was a great place. People coming in and out, people may want to hear a word. They may not have a church, so anybody could come and join us. And then we decided to get a radio slot. So again, he did a little radio tag, and that was being played. So we had all this going on. So every Wednesday we would go to the hotel, and we would, at that time, Of course, we didn't have a praise team. So, we loved the Katinas. We loved their worship music. So we would take their CD, and I had put together a CD, and I would take our little boom box that we had, and I had typed out all the lyrics to all the songs and created this notebook for everybody that would come to the Bible study so they could sing along with us in praise and worship. We would just do it. We would do it ourselves. So, we did that every Wednesday, and he would minister. We'd pack up our car, our little Honda Accord, and we'd drive the little car over to the hotel, and we would minister. Now, the first time we did it, of course, his family came, so we had a lot of people. They came, but they lived in Duplin County. They weren't coming to Wilmington every week to listen to him on Wednesdays. And besides, they had their own church, but they came and supported us that first time. And then I was telling people on my job at the school that I taught, and one of my friends came, and she brought a friend with her, and so that was another time. And I think that time we may have had 3 people. And then his job, he had to go out of town, and he does not believe in shutting anything down because he doesn't show up. So he looks at me and he says, "I guess you got to preach. You got to give the word." Mind you, I've never done that before. Never. I never done that, never envisioned myself ever doing that. And so I said, "Oh, okay, I'll do it." And so went home, put on my little dress, went to the hotel. They had set it up, and I had my little box, and I put my little music, the little notebooks in the chairs, and, just in case people came in. And I turned on the music. 7 o'clock came, and it was time to get started. Well, the room was empty. Nobody was there. So, he said, we're not waiting. We never wait. We just go right on in. So I started the music, and I started to sing, and, I'm just singing and praising the Lord and everything. And then, of course, nobody still came. And so me and the angels, and because that's what it was. And then all of a sudden, I got ready to give the word, and I was just like, man, this is kind of tough. And all of a sudden, I saw this little head come around through the door. And it was the custodial gentleman at the hotel. And he came in, and he kind of tilted around the door. And I'm just to give him the word, I'm just teaching my little heart out what I have. And he waved, and I waved back at him. And I said, you can come in. And he was like, no. And I said, and he stopped, and he said, "I don't mean to interrupt you." He said, "But are you okay?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm fine. I'm fine." I said, "I'm just preaching the word." And he looked around the room, and he did like that again, and he's tilted back out. And I said, "I know nobody's here." I said, "Nobody's here." I said, "But the angels are here. The angels are here." And he just looked at me, and he said, Are you okay? Are you sure you're okay? And I said, "Yes, sir, I'm okay." And then he just tilted on back out the door and closed the door. And I went on, and I finished, and I was done in about 30 minutes. So about 7:30, I was done. I was ready to go, and I packed up my stuff and went on. But when I think back to that, and I can laugh at it now because, at first I was kind of, timid and afraid. But when I think back to that, that was also a moment where God was testing my faith. Like, will you do it? Will you go in there when the room is empty? Will you stand before me and give the word? Because, again, he's there. But we tend to only want to think about the people that we can physically see. We don't think about him. We don't think about the fact that he's listening, and that this, was also a test. Like, was God testing me to see what I go through with it? And definitely I didn't want my husband calling home talking about, "Did you have Bible study?" And I don't want to lie and say, "Yeah, I had it." And then I really didn't. But I said, yes. He called me, and he asked me, he said, "Did you do it?" I said, "Yeah, I did." And he said, "How was it?" I said, "Oh, it was great." And he said, "Did anybody show up?" I said, "Of course not." And he was like, next time somebody gonna show up. I said, "Well, no, the angels came." And I said, "Oh yeah, the custodial worker came in and checked on me." I said, but I did it, and but that was faith. And so that's why I said faith is a choice. Faith is a decision. You have to decide how you're gonna walk by faith. And you have to decide that you're gonna walk by faith regardless of what the circumstances look like, regardless of who's backing you up, regardless of who comes to church, regardless of who's listening to your podcast. I don't care if 2-3 people join your podcast, but if you say that God told you to do it, then you just keep doing it. And that is why, I'll never tell somebody that God didn't tell you to do it, But we love to say what God told us to do. And then when it's not working out the way we want, we like to say, well, you know what, God, he told me not right now. And that's not the case. You know, that is not the case. So you have to keep pressing through, because I think about when we started this ministry, I'm like, you know, there were many times when I felt like, I was just like, Lord, this is tough. People show up, people don't. We didn't have all the help, you know, that we would have liked. At the time we were, you know, finances and so forth, things were hard. You know, it just seems like everybody else's ministry was taking off, but we were just stagnant. But, you know, we always looked and said, well, God sent us these people. They're here. If it's the same people we minister to every Sunday, they show up, we minister to them. We just stay in faith, and God will open doors. And slowly but surely, people started coming. God started blessing us. And you know, we may not be a huge congregation right now, but because of our faith, God is bringing the right people. He has always brought in the right people. He has kept us, and we're continuing to do his work, because it's not about us, it's always about him. And I like to think that we have touched lives, that people have been blessed, and that we're continuing to do that today. So that's why I say that faith is a decision. It is a choice. When Moses' mom decided to save her baby, she had to have faith in her heart. And God had to put that there. It just didn't show up. She had to have faith in her heart. And she also had a plan. Now, sometimes we have faith, but we don't have a plan. We just have faith. And so you always have to have a plan. So when she knew that she was going to hide him, she had to think about, well, how am I going to hide him for 3 months? And then once the 3 months is over and he's getting bigger, he said, then she had to think about, well, what am I going to do now? So I can just think that she was putting together a blueprint of what she was going to do for him, and how she was going to keep him, how she was going to save him. So she built that little basket, she got that blanket, and she put him on out there in the waters. And then she got her daughter, and she said, you go around there and you let her tell her that you have a nurse, and here it is. She had a plan. So if God has called you to start a business, get a plan. You just can't start a business with no plan and think it's going to prosper, and think that God is going to prosper it, because he's not. Get a plan. If you've called you to start a ministry of some sort, you have to have a plan for that. Who's your audience? Who is he calling you to? What is he calling you to do? You have to have a plan, because if you don't have a plan, if you fail, it's not God's fault. Because first of all, if he told you to do it, then he's going to give you the steps and the direction to do it. And some of the times, the things that he may tell you to do, you may not want to do. You may not agree with. You may think that, you know what, that's crazy. I'm not going to do that. And then God says, you know what, then you're not in faith. You're going to only trust God for as much as you think that he can do. So, and if you don't think that he can bring your vision to pass, then you're not going to trust him with everything that he puts in front of you. And so, again, that's why faith is a decision. Faith is a choice. So, you know, so today you have to ask yourself, what kind of decisions are you making? Are they decisions of doubt, or are they decisions of confusion? So, back to Moses, you know, he lived in the palace for 40 years. Again, he experienced all these great riches and all the great wealth, and he witnessed Egypt at its highest peak. So when I think about that, can you imagine how the devil must have really been mad at his mother when he saw what his mother had done, and how the plan that she made for him, how it manifested, and the fact that Moses did not die? But that was her faith, that was her choice. So, you know, when I think about Moses, and I think about, you know, he made that decision to go and, you know, go stand before Pharaoh, you know, at 40 years of age. You know, it was time for him to inherit or be next in line for the throne. If Pharaoh didn't have a son or any other children, he would have been next in line. So, but instead, I envisioned that he stood in front of the entire kingdom and announced who he really was. So I can see him going in front of Pharaoh, in front of all of Egypt, and telling them, you know what? I'm not going to be a Pharaoh. I'm not a Jew. I decide that I'm going to give all of this up, and I'm going to go suffer with my people. Now, you know, they were probably looking at him like, you idiot. Are you serious? No one would have known the wiser who he was. No one would have known, but he knew, and his mother knew. He refused to sit on a throne. He refused to be given the golden scepter, instead to go and suffer with his people. So I like to look at it as Moses taking off his royal garments and putting on his slave garments. I don't think we want to make that switch, because we like what we put on every day. I don't think if God, if God told us, I think if we look at it in today's time, I don't think it would be where, God said, I need you to give up your 6-figure job. I need you to sell your house. I need you to, downsize your car, because I got something for you to do. Because we'll probably say, well, God, why can't I still stay in my house? Why can't I keep my car? Why can't I keep my job and still do what you call me to do? Because those are always going to be things that will cause us sometimes to trip up. Not that God doesn't want us to have those things, but at the time that he's calling us, I think he's looking at our heart. And he's looking at those things that's going to keep us from moving in the place where he wants us to be. So like I said, when he told Pastor Newkirk to go back to Duplin County, he couldn't have done it here in Charlotte. There's too much going on in Charlotte. He said, I got to take you back to a dry place. I got to take you back to a place that you were so ready to get out of. I got to take you back there, because that's the only way I got to get Charlotte out of you. It's easy. It's going to be easier. Like we always say with Moses, it's easier to get Egypt, to take Moses out of Egypt, than it was to get Egypt out of him. And that's why he had to go back to Duplin County. He couldn't have sent him to, California or Florida. Too many things to do. I'm going to take you back to where there is nothing to do. And I'm going to give you a wife to go with you to help you out along the way. And so, and I always say that I know it was God. I know it was God, and I know it was God's grace for me to withstand and to do all the things that we did. When people always ask, how do you do it? I don't know how you do it. I say, it's not me. Because if I were given a choice, sometimes I think, because there were many times I was just like, let's just close it down. Let's just go get a job. We can just do what everybody else does. But you think that, you say that, but then you realize, no, because God calls you, you accepted it. Now you walk it out and you wait for him. And so I'm not going to tell you that there haven't been nights where I have cried and I've just boo-hooed, and we have sacrificed and we have lost, and things have happened, and we just didn't know how we were going to make it here or make it there. But God he always gives you just what you need right when you need it. And the fact that I believe that we were united in this thing as one, and that's what it means when you get married. Yeah, the two do really become one flesh. And so because we were on the same page, here we are today. Are we where we want to be ministry-wise? We're where we're thankful, but we know that God is going to expand and do something greater. And so we're just continuing to walk it out, and every day just wait on him to show us what to do next. So, summing up, Moses, Moses probably thought, because of the education that he received in Egypt, that it was going to be his intellect and his wisdom that was going to get them out of Egypt. But it was not. God had a plan. So then that's where Moses' faith had to come in. He had the faith to go stand in front of the throne and quote unquote stand in front of the throne and tell them what he was going to do. But now he had to allow God's wisdom and God's knowledge and God's plan to lead him through. And I know he probably never thought, and we know the story, he never thought he was probably going to have to do all the things that he did and suffer the things that he did. And then the people turned on him and so forth. He kept having to go back to God and so forth. But in the end, Moses led over 2 million people out of Egypt. And all of that was because his mother had faith and she had a plan. And then he answered the call as well. And he had faith, and God gave him a plan of how to do it. Now, granted, it took them 40 years, but they got through it. They made it through. So, and lastly, I just want to, one more person I want to look at, of course, and that is Esther. Like Moses, Esther was chosen for a specific time as well. She was born at a time when Israel was in captivity as a consequence to their disobedience. And when Esther's parents were killed, we know the story that her cousin Mordecai, her uncle, actually took her in and raised her. But Esther was, like many of us, ordinary woman living in an ordinary land, in a foreign land. She was part of a minority, a race that was looked upon, was not looked upon, that was frowned upon, that people held in low esteem. But we know the story that Esther, of course, ended up being the one to save the Jews. So let's look at Exodus 3, verses 8 through 10. So Exodus 3, verses 8 through, verses 8 through 10. And this is in the New King James Version as well. I may have put the wrong. Oh no, that's the wrong. My bad. That's not what I want. I'm sorry, Esther. I put down Esther 3. That's what's wrong. I'm sorry, guys in the back. I apologize. Esther 3, verses 8 through 10. Okay. Sorry, Sarah. And it says, then Haman said to King, I'm going to call him King A because I can't say that, said to the king, there is a certain people scattered and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of our kingdom, of your kingdom. Their laws are different from all the other peoples, and they do not keep the king's laws. Therefore, it is not fitting for the king to let them remain. If it pleases the king, let a decree be written that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who do the work to bring it into the king's treasuries. So the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. So here is the decree. You know, Haman did not like Mordecai, and basically he wanted the king to sign off that the Jews would be annihilated. He wanted them destroyed. Just a quick backdrop of that. So let's turn over to Exodus, see, my notes are still wrong. Esther 4, 13 through 14. Esther 4, 13 through 14. Sorry, Sarah. She has my notes in there. They're wrong. I was trying to do better than Pastor Newkirk. I was. So Esther 4, 13 through 14. All right. And Mordecai told them to answer Esther, do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this. So, and then you can go into Esther 5, chapter 5, and you can see Esther's the banquet that she had to, that she ended up having, and where she was, of course, given the scepter by the king, and so she was able to speak on behalf of the people. However, but Esther had a decision to make. She had to decide if she was going to join Mordecai and save the Jews, or if she was going to try and see if, because she was the queen and she lived in the palace, if she would be saved and play it safe. But either way, it was told to her, you know, you may have come to here at the palace for such a time as this, and at the same time, don't think that you won't perish as well. You may not perish with us at the time that we perish, but eventually it's going to come upon you. So, and that's something that we also have to think about. It may be that we may decide that, you know what, I'm not going to do it God's way this time. I'm gonna stay put. I'm going to do it the way that I see, because you know what, everything will be okay. And it may work out. It may work out for you for years, but there's going to come a time when you're going to have to answer. And when that answer comes, you're going to have to pay up. So why not go ahead and go through the trials go ahead and go through what you're having to go through so that so that you can receive the reward when you're supposed to receive it. So Esther's faith was a decision that saved her people. So, we know the story. She told them to go and fast and pray for 3 days, eat nothing, drink nothing. She didn't have time to sit and think about it. She didn't have time to sit, a couple weeks and ponder and go back and forth before God and what should I do, what should I do? She had to trust God right then. She had to have a plan right then. And she had a plan. Again, she had a plan. She told them what to do, and she went before the king, and we know what the result was. And as I have already stated, the king reached out his scepter, and he gave it to her, and she was able to speak and tell what happened and what had been, the decree had been for the Jews, and we know that the Jews, at the end, they were saved. So 3 things really quickly that I want to give you, and then I'm going to be out of your way. So the choice or decision to obey God through faith can or will result in 3 things. So when you make the choice, when you make the decision to obey God through faith, these three things are going to take place. Number 1, you are going to have short-term suffering. Don't think you're not going to suffer. Nobody wants to suffer. But, and I'm not saying that, that it's going to be, when people hear suffering, we're just like, oh my God, we crumble and we cringe. But you think about it, it's only for a short term. It's only for a short period of time. Moses' parents had to hide him for 3 months. Think about what it was like to hide a baby, I said it earlier, for 3 months. Moses suffered the loss of world's riches, honor, and prestige, and he was alienated from his adopted family. And then Esther had to make the decision to go before the king, even though she had not been called, and risk be putting to death. That's suffering. That's knowing that I could die if he doesn't do what I am desiring for him to do. But if he didn't do what she wanted. So you're going to have some short-term suffering. Everybody's suffering may look different, but it's only for a small period of time. It does not last. It doesn't last forever. Number 2, you're also going to have eternal blessings. So you go through the suffering, you get the blessing. So the choice of Moses' parents to hide him resulted in his upbringing in the palace. So he lived 40 years in a palace. He became one of the greatest leaders in the Bible who delivered the Jews from slavery. And he received Christ's riches. He already had the world's riches by living in Egypt. But through this, he received Christ's riches. And there could have been nothing greater than that. And then Esther, because of her boldness and courage, she saved her people as well. So think and you're like, well, what did Esther receive? What blessings did she receive? Well, she saved the people, but the people received the blessings. Sometimes it's not about us. It's not about what we're going to get, but it's about the people that are looking at us. And that's why, when we say we're going to do certain things and then we turn around and we say, oh, we're not going to do that. I think about that and it's like you're killing your witness to somebody who's watching you. Because they're watching you go back and forth. They're watching you waver. They're watching, well, you know what? She said God didn't do it for her. So you know what? I don't know if he's really going to do it for me. So then why bother? So it's not the blessings isn't always about you, but it's about the people that are watching you, the people that God has called you to, the people that you're shepherding because they're watching you and they are going to receive the blessings as well. And then number 3, you're going to receive spiritual growth. Spending more time in God's word and with Jesus, we are allowing the Holy Spirit to change us and to grow from within. There is no way you cannot spend time in God's word and don't grow. It can't happen that way. It shouldn't be that. So when you make that choice and make those decisions, you're going to have short-term suffering. Yes, you're going to get eternal blessings, but you're also going to have spiritual growth. And with that spiritual growth, as you're growing, your faith is growing. Your trust in God is growing. When we were we started doing the confessions for exhortation for tithes and offering when we were at the school. And Minister Capricia would get up and she would exhort in the tithes and offerings. And I remember one day, and she might not remember this, but I do. It's the little things to me. Sometimes, but she would get up. She got up one day and she exhorted, And, so y'all don't know some of the things that she said. It started 10 years ago. So when she first started saying, my tithes are increasing. She just got up one day and she said that. And she was like, my tithes are increasing, y'all. And I think we all just sat there and was like, okay, yay, your tithes are increasing. But then she said it every time she got up and did it. And then it started to click, that it wasn't just something that she was just saying. It's something that she was saying in faith. Because she was expecting her tithe increase. She was expecting a promotion on her job. She was expecting God to do more. So she was sharing that with us. And with her sharing that with us, we started to say it. And our faith started to grow, to get to that point about, yes, our tithes are increasing. And it started to manifest. We started to see that, Even as a teacher, you're like, well, what kind of promotion can you get as a teacher? You're in a classroom. But promotions do come, and not necessarily in the classroom, but thank God that, they decided to give raises for a couple years in a row. So my tithes did increase. So, and I think about her saying that at the time, it was just like, you think about, oh, well, that's just for that person. But when you latch on to what they're saying and the faith that they have, it becomes my faith, and I can have it as well. And then the last part that she would always say, and we say this now, and she says, and I trust God. That started in the school as well, because she had exhorted one time again, and she was just like, I'm just, she's like, I just trust God to do what I ask. She said, that's just where I'm going. That's how I'm growing. And that has always stuck. So now when we do our exhortation, now y'all know where all that came from. Came from Minister Capricia. But yes, and again, we say it, and it's like we say it and we mean it. I trust him. I have faith in him. My tithe is increasing. So yes, so your spiritual growth. She was growing spiritually, and not only did she grow spiritually, but she was encouraging us as well. And those who were sitting there, their spiritual growth also enhanced for that as well. So now y'all know where all that comes from and why we say it. Lastly, both Moses and Esther had God's power and used their faith to make decisions that affected an entire world. Or a group of people. And it was, again, it wasn't just their faith, but it was the power of God working within him. And so our very existence should be one of faith. You are not in faith if you are trying to control the situation. If you say that God is with you, then nothing else matters. You cannot control your situation and be in faith, because if you're trying to control the situation, then what you're doing is you're telling God what he needs to do, and he's not going to do that. And so the last thing, and this is just for you to ponder and to think about, so now is the time to ask yourself, am I ready to make some decisions? Am I ready to make some choices, a God choice, a positive choice, and stick by them? And am I ready to do that by faith? Because you can make some decisions, you can make the choices, you can be positive, you can say you're going to do it with God, but when you get ready to do it, you got to make sure that you're doing it by faith. Amen? Amen. That's all I have for you today. So you can stand to your feet.